Welcome to Board Game Binge, the place where we bring you bite-sized, bingeable board game content from across the industry. I'm your host, James Staley, and in this episode, we are welcoming back Daryl Andrews, a professional freelance game designer and consultant. You may know him from some of his popular titles such as Sagrada, Summits, Titanic, City of Gears, The Oregon Trail, and most recently, Batman: The Dark Knight Returns. Daryl, welcome back to the binge. How are you, man?
I'm doing well. Happy to be back.
Oh, it's great to have you. And I just mentioned a few of the titles you've been involved with. The list is too long. It would have been like a 5-minute intro, so I had to pick some, right?
I appreciate it. I've got to work with some good companies and some good people, so very thankful.
Absolutely. So I would be remiss for a couple of things. One is I want to say to our listeners out there that this is the final episode of the year, obviously, because we're like 2 days away from New Year's. I just want to thank everyone who has been part of this journey with us. It's been a fantastic year. I know there's been a lot of hardship for a lot of people, with everything that's going on in the world. And, having this little slice of joy for me has been kind of my thing that I look forward to each week. And hopefully the listeners have looked forward to it as well. I try to learn something in every episode. And my goal, quite frankly, is to people that are listening or watching, there's a little something in there for you as well. So again, from the bottom of my heart, I just want to say thanks for being part of this journey. Addition to that, I would say that we're going to get into Daryl's background, but we're not going to go as deep as we normally do into the background. If you want to check that out, go to episode 53. I can't believe it. There's been 90 episodes between the last interview we had, Daryl, and this one. Like, I can't even get my mind around it. 90 episodes.
That's a lot of episodes.
Yeah, it's a crazy amount. So, and I listened to it today on the way to work, and it was a great episode 53. So for those of you out there who want to get even more deep into the lore of Daryl Andrews, check out episode 53.
Yeah, I remember it. It was a lot of fun.
Oh, so yeah.
I hope people give it a listen.
Now, for those who don't do that, maybe, Daryl, you can give us just a quick overview of kind of who you are and kind of what you do in the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been designing board games since 2014. My first game, The Walled City, came out with Mercury Games. And ever since, I've been doing mostly freelance. I have worked for a few companies. I even started my own board game company for a year called Maple Games, which is still going today. Actually,
nice.
just had a Kickstarter not too long ago, Octopus Garden.
That was yours. I didn't know that was yours.
That was not my design. That was my old company, Maple Games. So
no kidding.
I actually signed that game to be published. So a few years later than originally expected, but I'm happy for Roberta. Phenomenal designer and an incredible design. Really great game. People need to check that out. It actually, it's a remake because I fell in love with the original game. And I just love to also support Canadian designers. And so that was a fun opportunity back in the day. But yeah, since 2014, I've got to work with a few different designers, got to work on some licenses, some fun stuff like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, or like things like Back to the Future, Oregon Trail you mentioned, Ghostbusters, you name it. And most recently got to work on a dream license with Dark Knight Returns, which was kickstarted and hopefully will be fulfilling in the next couple months. I got a preview advanced copy I got to see actually just a couple months ago at San Diego Comic-Con, and it looks amazing. So I'm really excited for people to finally get it in a couple months.
Yeah, I was looking at the page just before we went on air, and my gosh, like just the components, and I mean, people are watching can see the overlay I'm doing right now. The artwork is phenomenal. Like I've seen a lot of Batman games out there. Like if you search on Kickstarter, you're going to find a good number of Batman type games. But in terms of kind of fitting, I think, the thematic. This kind of really hit it on the mark. Now, this was actually a solo game, though, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's very different from anything I've designed before.
Yeah.
I've made board games that have a one player mode, but this was originally designed with a solo play in mind. This was the catalyst, was making a game for one player, and then we actually ended up in the design process finding a way to include a second player that we thought was a lot of fun. But the original goal was to make a one player only game, and then we included a few extra perks to make sure that it played one and two player well. But yeah, my first ever solo first design.
That's hilarious because you usually think, like, when I see Kickstarters, often there'll be like a multiplayer game and then they'll say, hey, we're working on potentially, if things go well, we're going to do a solo version as well. And I saw the reverse on that when you read the comments from this particular campaign. It was saying, this is a solo game, and hey, if things go, we're working on maybe a 1v1 option. It was kind of like a complete flip on convention, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, especially, not that we knew about COVID, but COVID proved that there was lots of people that still wanted to play games on their own, or maybe with just a partner or a roommate, a family member, and kind of work through something. So we were excited that was true, because we were already making it and designing it and hoping, we use the example, video games. Lots of people play those by themselves.
Yeah.
So we tried to make the case, and Cryptozoic believed in us in going for making a one-player game. And then, like you said, the campaign, people were asking. We didn't want to just add modes that didn't make sense, but we felt confident that the 1v1 mode would still honor the design and be a really fun time. We didn't add any other player modes because we didn't think the game was really made for that. So I'm really excited for people to discover the game and get to finally play it soon.
The minis were, some of the best minis I think I've ever seen.
Yeah,
like
minis were cool.
Oh, God.
They really made it quite a deluxe experience. When I finally got to see it, I visited actually the Cryptozoic headquarters, which isn't too far from San Diego, and it was really like I was a kid in a candy shop trying to contain but also enjoy all these cool minis and the batarangs, the custom dice that have the wings on them. Yeah, it was all really fun to play with. So I'm very pumped.
How did you go about bringing this together? Like, did this start off with you having a game that you brought to them saying, look, I think this would fit with the Dark Knight theme? Or is it more, the company was wanted to create a Batman game and then you kind of plugged in? Like, how does that whole thing kind of come about?
Yeah, I will say there's a lot of different ways for licensed games to come together, and some publishers do it in different ways. This one in particular, thankfully I had a relationship with someone at Cryptozoic who had just been kind of picking my brain about what were some, licenses and game ideas, and we got chatting about the possibility of doing Dark Knight Returns. And I remember in our conversation kind of talking about how not only is this just like such an important book to so many people, but who would want to not play Batman? Like, this is like the kind of game that if you were going to make a game like this, is everyone wants to be Batman. You'd be fighting over who gets to be Batman. So that kind of screamed like maybe it's the kind of game that needs to be a solo game. And in that brainstorm, in that chat, the wheels were in motion. I didn't realize of them then pursuing the license and then coming back to me and asking me if I'd like to do that. So that was, it really came to be through relationship. It came together because a publisher had previous good relations with DC. Cryptozoic makes some incredible DC games like the Deck Builder. Mm-hmm. And because they have success there and, right place, right time, sometimes it's better to be lucky than good. So
that license was in play then. So they already knew they would probably get the license, right? So that wasn't like...
Yeah, from what I understand, they pursued it in particular. They had relationships with DC on a regular basis, but even rewind, we obviously did not anticipate it to take this long. In the whole making of the game, it took probably 3 years.
Wow.
Because of COVID and everything. But The original goal was, hey, what if we made a series of DC comics where we focused on a particular novel that's kind of really important and crucial to each character? Is that going to happen now? I don't know. Probably not, unfortunately, because the world's changed and licenses and all those kind of things. But
Mm-hmm.
that was the hope, was like, hey, let's work on this, maybe with the goal of making it over the course of a year. And then it was a real roller coaster because that was the last Gen Con before COVID. And by the time we were, thinking we were kind of getting on a roll, then the world was starting to change. So
Turned upside down for sure.
yeah.
I mean, you and I ran into each other last at Pro Spiel North here in Toronto, and when we were talking, and then shortly afterwards, I saw images online of you going to PAX and so forth. We're both Canadians, right? So we're both live in central Canada here, or central-ish, right? And I know that the lockdown situation in Canada has been a much more difficult to travel, right? Living here than say in some other countries. And how did you navigate that? Because I mean, the number of pictures I've seen on you, like on a plane or in a convention hall somewhere, I'm like,
Sure. No, I mean it's not been convenient. I'll tell you that.
Yeah.
And it has just been recent. I mean, when we think about the many months that we were all quarantined and needed to do that, that was great. I'm glad that we did. But as it became possible, when it was, you had to take some extra measures and steps, but travel was possible and it was expanded beyond just essential workers. Then I took up that chance to travel and reconnect with some companies. I mean, this is my full-time job.
Yeah.
And so for me, at least, conventions and in-person meetings are unreplaceable. Some people during this time really found ways to go digital. Some people really thrived under things like Tabletop Simulator and doing Zoom pitch meetings and all that. For me, that's not a strength of mine. And so I knew for me to keep doing this, it was I either had to find another job, which not the ideal time to look for work,
Yeah.
or take safety measures, but then try to get to conventions. So ever since even Gen Con and since then, I attended Origins, I attended Essen, I attended, as you mentioned, Proto North, PAX Unplugged. Each of these were intentional but strategic conventions that I wanted to get back to, start meeting with people, wearing a mask, getting, testing before I depart, when I get back, a week later, things like that. There was a lot of tests. I joked that at least my friends knew that I had basically got a test every week, it felt like, and not just antigen tests, but PCR tests and all that, because different restrictions depending on where you fly and where you go. So yeah, I feel very well versed on travel restraints and all the extra hoops you need to jump through. But I'm thankful that they're there, keeping us safe. People are working hard, and thankful to be able to go back to cons, because they really, for me, have reawakened kind of business potential and different opportunities.
What did you like? So before things were kind of released, because at one point there was no window as to, okay, when is it going to open back up, and it wasn't looking good, especially for Canadians, right? Did you have a backup plan? Like, did you start working on, okay, here's how I'm going to have to shift over to Zoom-based pitches and things like that, or Zoom-based networking, or
I
what do you do?
honestly, I wish I had good backup plans, but I didn't. I was trying, like everyone else, to do the odd meeting or try the odd pitch. I mean, some publishers were offering kind of like online, pitch events or like online conventions. I attended them. I would take some meetings. I just didn't find they were fruitful. I didn't find that I was, you know, being able to get necessarily in the room with a decision maker. I wasn't finding, um, you know, even just like, it's hard to evaluate a game. Some people are better at, making great videos. Maybe, a designer is already a graphic designer as well
Yeah.
and can really make a sexy looking sell sheet. I tried some of those things too. I mean, I hired a few people to do some art assets to help presentation of ideas. I collaborated with different people that those are strengths, and so some of those games did better or showed better. So it wasn't a matter of not trying. I just didn't really see that it was going to be a long-term viable strategy for myself. I often look back now and I say, I really kind of focused on the few games that were already in the pipeline. If I didn't have those, I don't know what I would have been doing. But instead, I did have some games that were already signed by publishers. So I just focused on working on those a lot, trying to make sure like the development and those kind of steps were done well and support those titles instead. And it was kind of like work on a few things and work on them deep instead of on high quantity.
Yeah, I attended a free. I think it was maybe. I think it might have been Essen last year that the digital version, and
Yep.
I mean you can't replace it. And in my day job I've attended digital conferences. Right, it is not the same. It's not even close. Not even like the worlds apart from in-person conventions. Right, you have the whole camaraderie where you're running into people you haven't seen in a while. They're like, oh, have you met so and so? So you have like this person introduces you to that person. These kind of serendipitous moments that don't happen in a digital format, right? And there's nothing like the elevator pitch when you run into somebody, right? And you can't do that in digital format. So I can certainly appreciate the pain that this must have caused in the thick of all this. There is some people in our lobby that want to say hi. So we've got Merlene Petty said, hey, Games by Mondo, Eric Furston. They're all obviously big fans of your games. Eric was actually asking about, with the recent release of Spider-Man No Way Home, if your game Sinister 6 may receive some additional attention, perhaps expansion with more villains. That's a good question.
Yeah, great question. Unfortunately, not. So a few people might know of the game, but sadly not. It didn't really take off as much as I had hoped. Adrian Adamescu and myself got to work with Spinmaster and make a game called Sinister 6.
No, cool.
And it was honestly, again, talk about dream license. It was really neat because the game came together like in a really fun, fast way. We had designed a game that structurally worked really well, and then when the opportunity for the license came, we were already working off of a fun working game, and then got to pour all of our attention and love into making it very Spidey and really focus on the villains. But sadly, like all licensed games, they're very specific. So for instance, unless a game keeps doing well, that license usually expires pretty quick. So that's an example of a game that I'm very thankful to have been involved with, but sadly not a lot of people know.
So with this recent circuit, what were you pitching? Was there certain games that you were pitching, or were you more trying to make connections to kind of plan like then the further you're ahead?
Yeah, I definitely had a bunch of games that were in the hopper because over COVID, it's not like the ideas turn off. There was definitely, it slowed down because wasn't a very inspiring time, but still some new games and actually some old games reverted back to me. So even, for example, IDW was a company that I signed a bunch of games with and worked with a few different designers, and they got out of board games during COVID. So all the rights reverted back to me, not necessarily the licenses, but the game mechanics or the original IP stuff. So examples like a game like Roar, King of the Pride, I did with them, and I'm really proud of that, and co-designed that with Erica Bayoris. That was like an example of a game that came back to us that then I was showing around. It was kind of fun to have like a published copy, but then say like, hey, the rights are all back. Is this something that a publisher might be interested in? And so that amongst, some new designs and also some contract work were kind of what I was busy with. Especially PAX Unplugged, for example, I was less about pitching and more about play testing. I actually had a game that I have coming out with Goliath. I'm not officially allowed to announce the title or the license it's attached to. It's a very unusual license, but that game, for instance, the deadline to get the files in is kind of like end of year. Like I was just frantically today working on some last minute icon stuff. And so for me, PAX Unplugged was this great chance to just play test with a bunch of different people and try
cool.
to see.
Was this the one without saying the name that
it
I
is.
saw at the Pro Spiel? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So you saw it at Pro
It looked
Spiel
cool.
North.
That's all I'll say. It looked cool.
Thank you. Yeah. So that one in particular, like especially December, was frantic. Like, if people are willing to play test, I'll take it, because it's been hard to be able to play test the same, and the physical, putting a game through the paces is really important for anything from thinking about how long a turn takes, how long setup takes, all that is really hard to measure when you're testing digitally. So
Tabletop Simulator. I'd even say too, like, there's a certain level of understanding in a protospiel kind of format where the graphics aren't polished. Some of them might be just black and white, but there's a general sense everyone's kind of like, you got the personalities that come along with it, so it kind of tempers that, the lackluster look of some of these in that environment. Whereas in Tabletop Simulator, that same kind of basic artwork where maybe boxes on white cards isn't so great, right? It
really can get in the way. And like you said, like something like a Protospiel North, people are prepared to know this is a prototype, the expectations there, and everyone kind of works at, let's look beyond that and try to make sure the game is a positive experience. But like you said, like you put that on Tabletop Simulator, it's sometimes hard to have the imagination, or people aren't necessarily even used to playtesting and they're looking for a polished game, and you end up spending most of your time talking about graphics or box covers, which are all important conversations as well, but doesn't always help with the playtest.
Yeah, and certainly the prototypes that I saw at Protospiel, I mean, there's some pretty slick,
some people can be really good.
Prototypes.
Some people got some pretty cool skills. Also, we saw some pretty neat kind of like creative ideas with gimmicky 3D components, which is important. I mean, I don't say gimmick with a bad intent. I think we need things that make people want to buy them and try them and play with them and have fun. So
I was talking to Joe Slack on that.
Helps.
There was a game that a butterfly game that he was showing, and which it was on the table beside you, and it just looked,
I know it,
stunning, right? Like the prototype, which was all made by hand. It was an art piece. It really was. And so I looked at that, and right away, as a publisher, right, because I've now published games, I'm like, is this now overpromising what the actual publisher will be able to execute in a financially viable way?
Sure.
Right.
Well, I mean, it's funny you should say that, because that is a real problem too. I mean, I know specifically that game you're mentioning, because I've done some co-designs with Sylvain Plante, who was on the tag team.
He's a smart guy. Yeah.
He's wonderful. One of my favorite humans on earth. And it's funny because he will often create these masterpiece prototypes, and it's almost, in some ways, there's a couple cons to it, and I've experienced it because I've pitched games that we've made together. One is, like you said, they're produced so well that sometimes publishers are scared off by the potential costs.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, we just had fun with a prototype, but whatever a publisher thinks is the best viable product, we're open-minded. The other is, even on the development process, you start to get attached to the wrong things because it's just so pretty or so cool, and it's like, once you overproduce, sometimes then you're not open to cutting what needs to be cut. So
I almost wonder if it skews
really
the
important.
data a bit too, right? So if you're getting feedback on a game, right, and it's like, wow, people love that, they're in love with this game. Now, was the production quality part of what drove that?
Right.
And then when it now goes to mass market, is it going to have the same appeal, right?
Sure. I think that's really a valid question. It's an important one to ask, but then it also shows, on the flip side, like if you do come up with a cool game and then can also have amazing production, you can really, wow people, because people do have a lot of fun when something's just well produced.
I think it certainly helps too with the pitch, right? Like, again, I know I'm flip-flopping back and forth here, but when I think of like Sylvain, and I was looking at the different prototypes he had that week, right away you're like, how can I work with this person? Right.
Yeah.
This person obviously cares about quality. Impeccable attention to detail. there's obviously a lot of thought that goes into what they create. They're not just slapping something together, right? So I think there's a lot of kind of equity kind of comes along with that as well.
Well, and it shows also just like the creative possibilities. I think
Yeah.
another designer that I point to that, has this advantage but also disadvantage, and I've talked to them before, is Julio. He made Holy, and he made Control by Pandasaurus and a few others. His prototypes are the same way. They're these gorgeous, well-produced prototypes, and at least then that opens some doors so that people are curious to see what next he's making, because he is prolific and he is creative. And I think Sylvain's another example of that, where people see it and they're drawn in, and we want that. We want to make games that capture the imagination. We want to make things that make people smile and want to touch it and lean in and watch. So these are strengths, but they can, every strength can also work against you sometimes.
Jumping back to the when you made the comment of the licensing, or not the licensing, but the rights to the game that you got back this year.
Yeah.
How does that conversation go? Right. So I'm thinking for other people who out there who might be looking to have a game and they end up signing with somebody, and just probably put a clause in there that there's certain limitations that where the rights return back to you if certain things aren't met. But how does that conversation happen? Like when they realize, was it based on a clock? Like we're at the time we have to have the discussion, or how does that flow?
Yeah, well, I think this is a really important clause or section of all contracts that often isn't talked about, but I think it's really important, is thinking through what measures or what measurable data before a game should come back to a designer, and what comes back. What does that all entail? So how is that triggered? How do you exercise that? And I encourage designers to think about that even from the get-go. So maybe it comes back, for instance, if it's not produced by a certain time. So you can have a real actionable point in your contract of saying, if this game isn't manufactured by blank date, maybe the rights should come back. I even have had contracts either with an advance or what I call as a kill switch, where if a game comes back to you and never gets made, maybe there's a fee attached to that for that time that's lost.
Yeah.
That designer, thought this game was going to come out and it took, much longer and then never came out. Well, there's a little skin in the game where it says, here's maybe some type of compensation for that time lost. So that's an area that people can negotiate in their contract. And then another one is obviously on the back end. So thinking through like how long before, you go to the point of, okay, well, we tried, let's move on. Let's walk away and I'll be agreeable. This is business. And so let's just define those terms, make sure everyone's on the same page. So that might be, a lot of contracts will be like for X amount of years, 4 years, 5 years, with maybe some type of renewal if the game's continuing to sell, or an option to exercise, like, do you want to renew it? Is the designer get to submit something, or the publisher, where it says 6 months before 5 years you can submit to either end it or it renews every 2 years, or there's a lot of different ways that you can kind of structure it. For instance, IDW, the idea in our contract was that they expired at a certain amount of time, especially if there was zero sales, which once they were getting out of the board game business, no sales, they knew that. And thankfully, they didn't wait that clause. They recognized that, and they actually reached out and said, let's actually set up a document so that you have kind of assurance, and that you can confidently go to other publishers and say, I have the rights back for this. So they actually set up a release form, just kind of specifying that the rights to the game, the mechanics and everything thereof is back to the ownership of the original designers, and so that has been helpful. I know a couple games even from then have been offered contracts and stuff like that, so that's it's nice to reimagine or revisit some old designs. Other ones we pitched and then realized, ooh, there's some edges that we'd like to change, or some things that we'd like to redevelop. We've learned a few things over the years. So then they find like a new voice or a new kind of story.
So what do you do with a situation where, I know a lot of publishers, when they sign a game, then they're signing the rights to do what they want with that game, right?
Sure.
And that often might result in changes to the kind of how the game plays and certain mechanics they might introduce and so forth. So when you get those rights back to the game, is it kind of excluding those changes that were made by them, or how
Right.
does that work? Yeah.
Yeah, so one of the interesting things, again, I'll use IDW as an example. It's kind of easy because
Sure.
they're not in games anyways now, so they're not going to slap my hand for this. But like for instance, Adrian and I, we had sold them a game called Jungle Joust, and it is about you're literally riding on rhinos, jousting each other, and we had kind of like a dream idea of like having
That's
different
cool.
animals, and you could switch which ones were on which. But we designed it as a two-player only game. When we submitted and signed it, they ended up turning it into a six-player game, up to six players. And how would you do that with a jousting game? Good question. It's not. It actually had to add a whole nother mechanic of betting,
Yeah.
almost a la like a camel up, in that
Okay,
like
gotcha. Yeah.
you're
Love
not
that game, by the way. Yeah.
you influence the joust, but you bet on the results, and
Mhm.
so everyone can influence or bet. And it was fun, and they actually included us in all the dev of that, but that was with very specific goals and specific needs in mind. Probably the future version of that game will be a two-player game because in the long run
Mm.
for that game we realized, no, I think jousting, you think two players, you think two things crashing at each other, we'll cook that down. But it was all that extra work still like kind of reverted back to us in that contract. That's not to say that it always does. So it's important to specify that, if, for instance, I've had games come back to me where they say, the name, the art, and like the tone or style, we're keeping all that. Like that is, intellectual property that
Yeah.
we created for that game. You can have your original, rules back, but please morph that into a new direction, and that's fine too. I just think it's really important to like have all parties on the same
Make
page.
sure it's clear. Yeah, because if it's something where it's literally like a license, right, like a Batman, for
Yeah.
example,
Yeah.
I mean, they're not going to hand you over
No.
that license, right? So now does it become some other superhero that's maybe a generic superhero? But
Right.
to your point, they could say, well, it can't be a superhero because it's still kind of
Right.
competing with what we've created, right?
Yeah, and some you just have to walk away. You have to say like it served its purpose in its
Yeah.
time, but it might actually be easier or less work than trying to shoehorn it in a new direction. Maybe a fresh start and a fresh take. You just take the principles you learned from that
Yeah. And
and
there's
make
so
make
many
a new game.
ideas out there. I mean, gosh,
Yeah.
as you're saying, like every single time I sit down to play a game, my brother and I always will take a side bar like halfway into, or even we're setting the game up and like, oh, you know what we should do? We should do a game like this. And boom, another idea for a game comes out of like thin air. So
Yeah.
I'm sure there's no shortage of ideas out there that you can pursue. So what's your plan now going into 2022? Have you kind of have you have a new focus, or are you kind of still charging ahead with the current direction? Or I know a lot of people have looked at this past 2 years, which has just been an absolute crap show, and said, you know what, I'm going to take a step back, kind of
Sure.
evaluate things, and I'm going to kind of pivot a little bit. Is this
Yeah.
something you've gone through at all, or what are your plans?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think COVID has influenced me, and
Mhm.
and I can talk about that a little bit. But also, I just think it's a good practice, and
Yeah.
like this time of year, to just always kind of evaluate. I mean, we like games, we like strategy here, right? So,
Yeah.
I mean, having a successful year takes some planning, takes some intentional choices. It takes some slowing down, reading the room. So I think it's really important, and I try to do this every year to see what has been working, what isn't working, be honest with myself, slow down enough to like kind of be able to be self-aware and listen, and then project, try to come up with some business plans moving forward where you see some opportunities or some needs. And I think one in particular that I'm really excited about, and doors have slowly been opening, is opportunity to bridge what I would describe as mass market companies like the Hasbros,
Mm.
Goliath, Spin Masters, and then hobby market where there's phenomenal companies that seem they're pretty close to mass market anyway. Even a CGE
Mhm.
with like Codenames is a pretty mass market game,
Yeah.
or like Just One with Repos, but they're still like they're hobby companies. They're the ones that are at these like board game conventions. I think there's a lot of space in between. I think
Mm.
we're seeing examples like Codenames and Just One and whatnot that are proving that they do really well in mass market, but not a lot of attention has been spent there. So I'd like, one of the things that I'm trying to focus on is working on trying to make games that could actually meet both audiences and try to bridge even those relationships. If there's opportunities to find, ways for publishers to work together, or for me to pitch games with, some type of agreement like global versus North America, things like that. So that's one area that I'm really focused on and aiming on, and trying to kind of up my game, learning how to pitch, to Hasbro, how to pitch to some of these places, going to conventions like toy fairs and stuff instead of just, hobby board game conventions. So that's changing the way I work a bit. The other, for me, and people may really disagree with this one, is as much as I think there's opportunity to make some elegant games for that space in between, I think there's also a market for more complexity, but still in shorter games and smaller games, things like that. I think we only think of complex games as these giant box games with, like, you have to learn them over, a day or two. And I think there's some space now where we've played a bunch of games that took 20, 30 minutes. Maybe we can, find a game that's kind of like a follow-up, or you start to get into the hobby a bit more, or you're looking for something a little crunchier, but it doesn't have to be a $150 investment. Maybe there's some games that we can still buy for $50, but it runs for 50 minutes. And so that's another area, is like still being mindful of component costs, still being mindful of size, still being mindful of price point, but still having some complexity. I think people are really open to learning games because they want to play them a bunch of times.
Well, that's awesome. It's always amazing talking with you, because you're very good at the 30,000 foot view, and then you can go super deep on any topic, which I think is awesome. I want to wish you all the best in this coming year, 2022. I think we all deserve to have just an amazing, amazing year. Any of the listeners out there, if you've enjoyed this podcast, thank you again. I hope you keep coming back. We're going to try to keep getting some newer content for you, and some other ideas, and try to find other parts of the industry that maybe we haven't even touched yet, and get guests on our show to learn about that. So again, I just want to wish everyone a happy new year. Thanks again for listening, and you take care. We'll talk to you in 2022. Cheers. This has been an episode of the Board Game Binge podcast, hosted by James Staley, produced by James Staley and Mike Bruner, with original music by Nick Smith. If you would like to watch these interviews live, simply join the Facebook group Board Game Binge, and you'll get access to live interviews, giveaways, and interesting board game content from across the industry. I can't wait for you to join us. See you next time.